Good evening. I've recently had to stand in at very short notice at a piece of musical theatre, and as I'm playing a somewhat younger character, I've had to dye my hair and beard a rather darker colour than they naturally are at the moment. But this made me think about the whole issue of drama and theatricality in the light of Jesus's procession into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, the very first Palm Sunday 2,000 years ago. And there is a sense in which this was a highly dramatized, highly staged event. If we can imagine the setting, the crowds streaming into Jerusalem to celebrate Pesach, the Passover, and all of them will have been on foot. And by arrangement, it seems, Jesus traveled on a donkey or a mule. The texts are slightly uncertain what particular animal he was on. But the point is, he will have stood out dramatically from the rest of the people around him and will have created quite a stir. Now, it was deliberate. It was clearly deliberate. It was not unknown for people who wanted to make a point as a prophet to live the symbolism that they were trying to convey. And so one of the things Jesus is pointing back to, it seems, is a prophecy from Zechariah, where the humble king of the Jews is portrayed coming into his city to take possession of it on a donkey, or alternatively a mule. And so this enacted theatricality is significant of the kind of thing Jesus did. It seems that everything he did was intended to convey some sort of message. Nothing was done by accident. Nothing was done for no reason. And so when we read this story, it seems to me important to look into what the drama is intended to convey, what the symbolism is intended to convey. And to call it theatrical and dramatic, of course, is not saying anything frivolous about it, because when God is involved in doing something dramatic, when God is setting a theatrical scene, this is true theatre, this is true drama. It is deeply serious. There is nothing flippant or frivolous about it at all. And that is the case in what Jesus was doing. Some sort of symbolic act which was supposed to convey something to his followers and to the other pilgrims going into Jerusalem. And there's no surprise that it created quite a stir, that people picked up on the symbolism and proclaimed him as the king who was coming to save them. And it is also no surprise that the authorities in Jerusalem felt deeply threatened by what Jesus was doing, because this was a new kind of king, apparently coming to take possession and so disrupt the social and political order of the city, the fragile entente that the Jewish authorities had managed to establish with the Roman occupying power. But there is something more to this story which was only brought home to me comparatively recently in the writings of Richard Bauckham, who investigates John's version in particular of this story. And if you look at John's Gospel, this is something that hadn't really occurred to me, surprisingly, because it's kind of pretty obvious when you look at it. In John's version of the story, Jesus' entry to Jerusalem is prefaced by his raising of Lazarus. It is further made clear that Jesus' raising of Lazarus, not surprisingly, heightened the tension of the time. It heightened the tension of the days around Passover. Not only did it mean that Jesus became even more notorious than he had been before, and people started to follow him, started to proclaim him, started to show much greater interest in him than they had before, but also the Jewish authorities were yet more frightened of him, yet more troubled by what he was doing. And according to John, it was after the raising of Lazarus that the authorities in Jerusalem, the temple priests, actively start to conspire to have Jesus killed. And in that context, it's even less surprising that this divinely stage-managed entry to Jerusalem causes such an enthusiastic response from the crowds, because this is somebody who has done something utterly unprecedented, raised somebody from the dead who had been in the tomb for several days already. This is not somebody who had perhaps been in a coma, who was brought back from the brink of death, because such things were known not only from Jesus's own previous work, but also it was something that was occasionally claimed for other holy men and wonder workers. But in the case of Lazarus, it is made very clear in the story that he was properly dead. And even in this story of the raising of Lazarus, there is an element of divine drama, of divine theatricality, of something that is stage managed in a deeply serious and profound way. The way in which Jesus comes to the tomb and commands Lazarus to come forth. And you can imagine, if such an event can be imagined at all, and it is extremely difficult, you can perhaps just about imagine the shocked and stunned response of those around him when Lazarus did indeed come forth from the tomb. And this setting of the Palm Sunday story in the context of the raising of the dead, the raising of Lazarus, tells me something very important and very profound about what Jesus was coming to do, the kind of king he was proclaiming himself to be. Now, when we read and reread this story and proclaim its message, we're always wanting to look for something perhaps more sophisticated, something a little bit new, a little bit interesting, a little bit different, a little bit more difficult perhaps to get our heads around in trying to understand what Jesus himself was trying to do. But whenever I investigate this, whenever I read this, whenever I pray about it and think about it, I keep coming back to something that is so simple and obvious, yet utterly startling, so simple and obvious that you might think that this is the stuff of fairy tales, that this is too much of a magical ending. But it is not that. It is something that runs like a golden thread through the whole gospel message, and it bears repeating time and again in all the contexts and all the different forms in which it appears, and in all the discussions about what political points Jesus might have been trying to make, the relationship between him and his followers, the relationship between him and the chief priests, the precise nuances of his teaching and his actions. And it boils down to this incredibly simple and straightforward, yet utterly profound, yet utterly shocking, yet utterly wonderful proclamation that what Jesus was doing entering Jerusalem was coming by the power of love to overcome the power of death. It is this dual aspect to what Jesus did and what he was, which makes me a Christian, and is something that I don't find as a hope, as a triumph, as a victory anywhere else in any other philosophy, in any other part of the world. This divine use of the power of utter love, which is the essence of God's nature, to overcome the power of death itself. Death must be faced, death must be gone through, and Jesus himself went through a terrible death, as Christians are shortly to commemorate on Good Friday. But behind it all, there is this wonderful hope that love does not end. Love cannot be conquered by death. In fact, it is death that is conquered by love. And in what Jesus did, it is shown to be true. And that is such a wonderful hope that I would ask us all perhaps to keep before our eyes in the dark days of commemorating Holy Week, and the dark days which many of us will continue to have to experience in the difficulties of the world, particularly at the moment. The wonderful hope of the conquest of the power of death by the power of love. And may you all have a very blessed and God-filled Holy Week. And may God bless you all this day and forevermore.